Alright guys, welcome to Module 2. This is obviously going to be the first lecture. We're going to have a lot of fun over the next 2 months where we're going to start detailing a lot about anatomy and biomechanics and how to tie all of this into exercise programming when it comes to strength, hypertrophy, cardiovascular training, and then at the end we're going to wrap this up with practical coaching if you are here in Brisbane. If you are somewhere else in the country or even overseas, you will have received specific information around how that will occur, whether it's via Skype or a huge call or whether it's an actual in-person seminar. So the end outcome of this whole module is obviously to make you a fucking weapon when it comes to understanding what to look for, how the human body works, and how to create really good training programs based on sound principles when it comes to anatomy and physiology, but also in terms of critical thinking, and you're going to see this especially in the second lecture. Now, before we move on, I do apologize in advance if I'm coughing or if I'm not talking clear enough. I'm here with a bit of sinus infection and things like that. So apologies for that in advance. Hopefully I won't annoy the shit out of you, and then we'll go. So first of all, we need to define what anatomy and biomechanics, what that actually means. And in terms of anatomy, that's just a study of the actions and the different functions of joints and muscles. And as you're going to see later on, certain joints, they have particular movements that occur especially predominantly. And you're also going to see that the different planes of movement doesn't happen in just one plane of movement. Movement happens across all planes of movement relative to the joints that we're measuring that movement at. And then you're also going to notice over the next 3 to 4 weeks that different muscles create different actions at these joints, and that's going to govern how you move. So right now we actually debunked one of the biggest myths in the fitness industry, and that's how people always say that you shouldn't train muscles, you have to train movement. But we just said that muscles create movement, so therefore you're going to have to know anatomy and how muscles create movement around the joints in order to create the best training programs possible. And this obviously changes. So when it comes to biomechanics, which is sort of just tying in a bit further with anatomy, that's the study of the mechanical laws that pertains to, in our context, the human body and how we move in the environment. And the environment being whatever space you're in, whether you sit down on a couch or whether you're outside walking or whether you're in the gym lifting. And you're going to see that this becomes incredibly important to understand when people have different injuries, they have different goals, they have different complications that will sort of alter the theoretical anatomy that we learn. So that's why things are important. You know, people go, oh, you don't have to study this, you just need practical experience coaching people. It's like, yes, that's really important as well, but what if that practical coaching experience has been done the completely wrong way? What if you've been coaching all the movements the wrong way? Then you're going to have to unlearn all this really bad stuff. So knowing anatomy and knowing basic biomechanics is really important because structure is different for everyone. Your hips are not the same as my hips, and your shoulder has not undergone what my shoulders have undergone, especially not your back and my back. And the way our body is structured does dictate how movement occurs. And when you know all of this, like we just spoke about, and you apply critical thinking, you will be able to design better training programs for your clients. And when you get that in, you're also going to see things in a different way because what you see is based on how much you know about a certain thing and your experience and understanding of whatever that topic or thing might be. And therefore, you're going to be able to understand how to coach and how to cue someone a lot better. And obviously, like we just spoke about, what you can and can't do when you're working with clients that might be injured, and also knowing when to refer out to the appropriate allied health professionals. So what we're going to kick off with first, after I've taken a sip of coffee, is anatomy housekeeping. And I'm very aware that the majority of you guys have gone through this already. Hopefully you should have gone through that in your certifications. But there's nothing wrong about recapping what we know. So we have the anatomical position, where it's sort of, we use that to determine the various baseline key points such as planes of movement. And anatomical position is if you stand straight up, you face forward, you have your palms down by your side with your palms facing forward, and you have your feet pointed straight ahead. That's very baseline. That's just what we define as the anatomical position. And here you can see two different pelvises or pelvi where they aren't the same. These are very different. On your left hand side, the darker pelvis has a deeper socket that's rotated a bit more forward, a bit more anteriorly, and then you have the lighter coloured pelvis there where the hip socket is tilted a bit more towards you. Now those two people are not going to squat the same, and that doesn't necessarily have to do with tight hamstrings and tight low back and immobility and not being flexible enough and all that kind of stuff. It actually has to do with how your bones and your joints are structured and how that will dictate how we're set up in the squat. Just as an example. Now moving forwards, the appendicular skeleton is the part of the skeleton that doesn't align vertically or axially. And when you think about it, appendages are things that are kind of attached to other things. That's what an appendage is. So the shoulder girdle, as an example, attaches to the spine and the rib cage. So the appendages attach to the axial skeleton. And the same with your lower body. Your legs, they attach to the hips, therefore they also attach to the spine via the sacrum. So the axial skeleton is therefore what's not the appendicular skeleton. It's the spine and the rib cage and the bones of your skull. And then people also talk about, the smaller bones that are inside your ears, and people talk about your sternum and all that kind of stuff, but that's not going to make a huge difference to your big understanding of the very basics of anatomy. So here we have old man Sam on the right here showing off his guns, and you'll see that his arms, they're a part of the appendages, the appendicular skeleton, because they attach via the clavicle to the rib cage and the spine, and therefore the axial skeleton. And you'll see Taylor on the left hand side, she's doing a split squat. She's sort of midway, either up or down in a split squat, which kind of looks like she's on her way up, where her legs, her appendicular skeleton is moving while her torso, her axial skeleton is standing, relatively still. Now, let's just rush through this, and we're going to define a few different key movements when it comes to anatomy. So we have flexion, where you are decreasing the distance between two relative points. So when I'm doing a biceps curl, I'm closing the distance on the way up between my palm and my shoulder. So I'm closing the distance, which is flexion. Extension, I'm opening the distance and I'm lengthening the distance between 2 points. Abduction and adduction, abduction and adduction. Abduction, you're moving a limb away from the midline of your body. Think about abducting someone. Abduct, you're taking something away. And adduction, you're bringing something back towards the midline of the body. And then if you think about flexion and extension, that can also happen in the horizontal plane, where you're either closing or opening the distance just in a different position relative to space. It's a different posture. And then we have what we call circumduction, which is it's a circular movement that looks like a cone, but it's not just a rotation. It's going to have to be a 360-degree rotation. And then for some reason I haven't put in rotation and gliding, but rotation obviously happens around an axis that's still. So if you remember back to physics in year 12 or whatever it might have been, you have an axis of rotation where the movement happens around. Same as the wheels on a car, they happen around the axles. And then every single joint in your body has to do some kind of gliding. It sort of moves a tiny bit back and forth, the two surfaces that are involved. They move a tiny bit back and forth in relation to each other. They just glide nicely. That's not a lot. And then we have supination and pronation, which is the rotation of your forearm relative to your upper arm, with either the palm facing up or the palm facing down. And I'm fairly certain that you already know what all of these are, but it's really, really important that we do consider these and really hone these in. So flexion and extension, that happens in the sagittal plane. Abduction and adduction, that happens in the frontal plane. And rotation and supination and pronation, which is also rotation, that happens in the transverse plane. So here we have flexion, where I'm closing the distance between my palm and my shoulder, and then I'm extending my elbow, where I'm lengthening the muscle and I'm opening the distance between my palm and my shoulder. And then I have abduction and adduction of my shoulders and my hips, where the abduction is moving either my leg or my arms away from the midline of my body, for then adducting, adducting back in towards the midline of my body. So the sagittal plane is where we just said extension and flexion primarily happen. And they are slightly different from your upper body and your lower body, just because the plane of movement is relative to the joints we're talking about. And then we obviously have the frontal plane, where abduction and adduction happen. And then we have the transverse plane, where rotation primarily happens. Now, if you imagine being in a squat, and we're going to go through that right now. So I'm in a squat position, and I've just stopped parallel instead of going all the way down, because it's easier to see the relationship between my thigh and my torso, where the sagittal plane of my upper body is exactly where the kettlebell is, so in front of me and behind me. That's flexion and extension of my spine. And then I have to take into consideration that if I move my thighs into that same position, that's not going to be flexion and extension and the sagittal plane of my thigh bones. So the sagittal plane of my thighs in this position here, when my feet are slightly externally rotated and everted, is actually slightly out to the side on an angle. And that's really, really important when it comes to optimizing technique and force production and finding something that's really comfortable for your clients to do. And then we obviously have a lot of different bony landmarks and things like that. And we're going to go over a few of them, especially on your shoulder blade, your scapula, and in your hips. So bony landmarks for your scapula are the spine of the scapula, the infraspinous and the supraspinous fossa, the acromion and the glenoid fossa. The infraspinous fossa is where the infraspinatus muscle sits. The supraspinatus sits in the supraspinous fossa, which is just above the spine. And then the acromion is where the AC joint is formed, the acromioclavicular joint, where the acromion process meets with the clavicle and they form the AC joint. And the glenoid fossa, that's where the head of my upper arm attaches to form my glenohumeral joint. Now here I couldn't find this little animation for... Oh, nope, that didn't. Let's try again. There it goes. Beautiful. I couldn't find one of these animations for the shoulder, the shoulder blade, the scapula. But here now, if we let this rotate around, we have, this is the back of your pelvis, where we have your ilium in red, and then we have your sacrum sitting right here. And these two bones here, this is still the back, these are called your ischium. So these are your sits bones. And then if we rotate right there, you can see your pubic bones on either side right there. Now, if we were to rotate this a bit further right there, now we can see a few bony landmarks. Up here we have your anterior superior iliac spine, which is your ASIS. Then we have your anterior inferior iliac spine, which is your AIIS. You'll see how this is the ilium, this is the superior, which means above spine, and this is the inferior spine, inferior meaning below. And then you'll see the hip socket here as well, which is called your acetabulum. And outside of that socket here, you have a little ligament that further strengthens that hip socket and that hip joint. And then we also have your posterior superior iliac spine, sits right here, and then we have the inferior superior iliac spine as well. So that's the rough anatomy of your hip, and you'll see that little socket there as well, that little hole. Through here you have a lot of nerves and blood vessels and muscles and things like that that help you with a lot of different things for your pelvis. Now let's move a bit further and we'll look on a few very general aspects of contractions and muscle fiber types. And we're going through this relatively quick just because you've already gone through this in your Cert 3 and your Cert 4, maybe even your Diploma of Fitness or your university degree. So in terms of muscle contractions, we have eccentric, which is the lengthening of the muscle belly itself. And that tends to happen very passively. You can't actively create a lot of force. And in the eccentric component, you can actually load your muscles more than 100% because you can not shorten the muscle with as much load as you can lengthen your muscle. And the shortening of a muscle is a concentric contraction, which happens actively. And it's really important to note in terms of concentric contractions that you can very, very rarely actually get 100% contraction concentrically. And that's really important to remember. And then we have something called the isometric contraction, which is you keep the same tension all the time, but you actually don't change the length of your muscle. And isotonic, we have a constant change in length, which is kind of what we term a normal contraction. And then we also have something called isodynamic, where we have to do them bilaterally. So we have to do them, especially if we're doing biceps curls, I can hold one arm isometrically and not change the length while I'm moving the other arm, and then once I'm done moving one arm, I can swap over and keep one arm still and keep the other arm moving. So if you ever see the term isodynamic, That's what it tends to refer to. So you'll see here that on the left here, we have a bench press, the bottom position, where I'm now relatively isometric. Remember that definition? There's no change in length, but there's a lot of tension there. The action coming down into that position from a bench press is eccentric, especially around my triceps and my chest muscles. But now I'm actually actively pulling the bar down by using my upper back. So there's a concentric contraction. Then you'll see in the upper right hand corner, I'm in the very back end position of a reverse crunch for my abs. So then the concentric, the shortening of my abs is pulling me back into that position. And then when I'm lengthening back out again, I'm lengthening my abs and I'm eccentrically contracting my abs. And then in the bottom position, I'm very, very isometric. There's no huge length change in my glutes, my rectus spinae, or my abs. I'm just holding a static position. So moving on, we have different muscle fiber types, which you can see down in the right hand corner here, where on the left hand side of that little picture we have what we called more of a red muscle, and then we have a mixed muscle and white muscle. Now these are just sort of descriptive terms to help you realize that we have type 1 muscle fibers which have access to a lot of mitochondria and oxygen. And these are very, very fatigue resistant. When you have a lot of access to oxygen, you can keep doing a lot of activities for a very long period of time, because the intensity of those activities, they have to be a lot lower. And they get their reddish kind of color because they have access to a lot of oxygen. So that's type 1 fibers, and we call them oxidative muscle fibers. And then we have type 2A and type 2B fibers. The type 2A fibers, they're sort of a mix between the two. So we're going to go through your type 2B fibers first to give you a better understanding of how they are. So if you look down in the very right hand corner on the white muscle, they are type 2 fibers. So they're, technically speaking, the complete opposite of these red muscle fibers, where they're something we call glycolytic. And they're glycolytic because they're involved in glycolysis, which is the fact that they utilize the broken down carbohydrates into glucose as fuel. And they don't have a lot of mitochondria in them, so therefore they don't have access to a lot of oxygen. So if we compare the two, we compare the red and the white muscle fibers, it has to be a different color than the red muscle fibers, and we give it the color white. Now these guys can't do a lot of work for a very long period of time, but they can do a lot of work in a very, very short amount of time. And we're going to come full circle on this over the next few months, and that's going to start to make a bit more sense to you then. And then in the middle, we have the type 2A fibers, and they are glycolytic oxidative because they're a mix between the two. And they are more red in color than the white ones, but they're not as red in color as the type 1 fibers because the oxygen content is a lot less. And they are somewhat fatigue resistant, and they can also do a tiny bit of forceful work, but it's not as forceful as the white muscles. Now what's really interesting with muscle fibers, and I find this very, very fascinating, is that you can change muscle fibers via two primary ways. And you can do that by the proportions of the fiber type or the amount of cross-sectional area each fiber type has. And we know that these type 2 muscle fibers are a lot more forceful because what we call the stretch shortening velocity, how fast they stretch and lengthen and then shorten in order to produce force, is a lot higher compared to the type 1 muscle fibers. And that makes perfect sense. If you want to lift something that's really, really heavy, you need that velocity to be extremely high in order to overcome the resistance of whatever object it is that you're trying to move or get over. Now, we also know that genetics are incredibly important when it comes to how these muscle fibers are distributed around your body. Some people are sort of, for the lack of a better term, genetically predisposed to do better in cardiovascular activities compared to power sports such as sprinting 100 meters or doing boxing or MMA or powerlifting or whatever it might be. Now, we also do know that strength training can increase the number of all different fiber types, and that's very specific to the kind of training we do as well. But what's really, really cool is that when we remember that we have type 1, type 2A, and type 2B muscle fibers, what's really, really cool is that the type 2A muscle fibers can actually be trained to become type 2B muscle fibers and become even more forceful and less like the type 1 muscle fibers. But it's very, very unlikely that you will be able to change the type 1 muscle fibers to type 2 muscle fibers. And this obviously becomes very important when we're going to design training programs and things like that. We need to take this into consideration. It's going to be incredibly hard for you to measure this in some people, but if someone tells you that, oh, I have no trouble running 20 kilometers, but after a 30-minute weight session, I'm absolutely smashed. Now, that's going to tell you something about the potential, the very potential fiber distribution in that person and how they're potentially genetically predisposed and how that can help you understand how to potentially program better for them. There's a lot that you're going to have to consider, especially in terms of their experience with running compared to weightlifting, the ratio of running to weightlifting, their food, their recovery abilities, and all that kind of stuff also becomes very, very important. But where it comes the most important is to understand that certain muscle groups are more dominant in type 1 muscle fibers and other muscle groups are more dominant in type 2A or type 2B fibers. Now, you can also have different portions of each single muscle group that has a higher proportion of either fiber. Now, those sort of subsegments within each muscle group is probably not going to make the biggest difference in terms of programming, but it's also going to help you understand that planning the training of an individual to go from one phase of training to another phase of training where you have different sets, different repetitions, intensities, frequencies, and volumes and things like that is going to be incredibly important. And take into consideration as well that the lower body tends to be higher in fast twitch muscle fibers, which makes perfect sense because you don't run with your arms, you run with your legs, and that's going to take a lot more force in order to overcome gravity, overcome friction, and all that kind of stuff. So it all makes perfect sense when we think about it. So again, this is what we just spoke about, the training applications of especially the different segments of one muscle group is going to be negligent. It's not going to be a huge thing that you have to remember. But if you can remember that muscle fiber distribution changes in different muscle groups around your body, that's going to have a huge impact on how you decide to program for someone, and especially how you decide to plan out the training program in order to get the most out of their training. And that's it. I don't want to overload you with a lot of crazy kind of information in this first lecture. Next lecture is going to be a lot more advanced, but I need you to recap this quite thoroughly so you understand all of these terminologies and all these concepts so that when we start the second lecture, we're all on the same wavelength. Also, remember to go through the workbook, answer the questions, and make sure that you're up to date with all of that. Do your focus and actions as always, and that's it. Awesome to see you guys in this lecture as well, and I'll see you next week.